So, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends of the Macau Rich Institute and the University of St. Joseph, it is really a privilege and a joy to welcome you all now the first time here in this beautiful new Newman Center. And I would, of course, extend a very warm welcome to our dear friend, Professor Thierry Meynard. Obviously, we would have, shall we? So, I think many of you are aware how many years Professor Meynard has contributed significantly in the field of the cultural exchange between China and the West, and was extremely productive also in terms of reflection on Buddhism, Chinese Buddhism. And we now just have to face this new regulation. So Professor Meynard is in Gongbei and could not come here, but let's make the best out of it. So we forge ahead with his lecture, so 1 hour, and then we have Q&A. I also want to mention, I think there's no point to mention all endless articles. We all admire how productive and creative Professor Meynard is, but I want also especially to mention that Professor Meynard is our correspondent of the Macau Rich Institute Journal in China. So we owe him also a lot of gratitude. It's right now not possible that we have Chinese scholars as correspondents. So I think over many years, Professor Meynard managed to get these links to Chinese scholars, and that's extremely precious. So over to you, and thanks again. Merci beaucoup. Avec nous, cette soirée.
Yes, thank you very much, Father Rofflin, for this introduction. And I'm very happy to be very close to you, but not yet with you. And I was really looking forward to come to Macau. I have been in mainland China already for 1 year, but without leaving mainland China. And so I was expecting to come to Macau. But I'm very happy to see my colleagues from the University St. Joseph and from the University of Macau, and because I think I am discussing with topics that may be of common interest about the encounter between the Chinese culture and Western philosophy and also theology. So I'm going to share my screen now and my PowerPoint, like that you can see. Yeah. So I'm going to talk about a Jesuit who is not very well known, and because his name is François Noel, and the book also, which is not very well known, and I explain why, is Philosophia Sinica in 1711. So, okay. So I would like to start with the concept of hermeneutic of suspicion. This concept was in fact designed by a French philosopher called Paul Ricoeur. And Paul Ricoeur used this concept to discuss a philosopher, I mean a German philosopher of the early 20th century, Marx, Freud, and Nietzsche. Because those philosophers, in fact, they represent a kind of a school of suspicion, according to Paul Ricoeur. That is to say that they share a commitment to unmask the lie and the illusion of consciousness. So, of course, they do that from different ways. I mean, Marx looking mostly at the structure of the society, Freud, I mean, and Nietzsche. But I would like to use this idea of a school of suspicion to look at the encounter with China. So we know that in China, there was a very strong interest in Europe for ancient civilization and thought. And so there was a positive reading of the ancient civilization, for example, like Egypt or like Greece. And so we have the term of Prisca Theologia, the ancient theology. And so the idea that in the pagan philosophy of the ancient world already contain some traces of divine revelation. And so people even will find the idea of the Trinity, etc. And so it's to say that already you have some elements coming from God, coming from the good spirit. So that I should say is a positive reading of ancient culture. But you have also the suspicious reading. And so that is more in link with the school of suspicion. So this suspicious reading is to say that, of course, is to recognize that there are many signs and many symbols of ancient text. And those signs and symbols seem to talk about God, talk about religion. But in fact, those ideas are very dangerous. They appear religious, but in fact, they are coming from the bad spirit. They come from Satan. And so the task is to unmask the working of Satan and because in fact, those texts, somehow they have an appearance of truth, an appearance of honesty, but they deceive people. And so we see that we have the two different readings about China, which are going to conflict. A positive reading, and mostly Matteo Ricci, but also a suspicious reading. And so here, I would like to discuss first about the book of Alessandro Valignano, that it is a catechism used in Japan in the 1580s. And in that book, you have the idea of double teaching. Is to say that you have externally, external teaching. It looks very much religious, a lot of devotion, a lot of good things. But in fact, people have, the missionary have to go beyond this kind of external appearance and to go inside, and they find out that inside, in fact, you have a thinking which is atheistic. And so mostly they use Aristotle to say that the materialistic, because you don't have a distinction between the spiritual and the material. And so there, and beside this book of Alessandro Valignano, a very important player is a Jesuit called Rodriguez. And because Rodriguez, Lujohan, was in Japan, in fact, he joined the Jesuit in Japan, and is going also to make this theory that everything in Japan, in fact, are a symbol, and those symbols have been conceived by the elite, by the Japanese elite, the political elite or the intellectual elite, to mislead the people into atheism. And because those people, according to Rodriguez, they use religion, but only as a political tool to control the common people. And so Rodriguez is very important because when he leaves Japan in 1615, he comes to Macau. And from Macau, after, he goes, of course, to mainland China, and is going to be very influential. So in mainland China, in fact, so we have also the positive reading of Chinese culture. So that it is Matteo Ricci in his book, The Tianzhu Shui. And so, of course, he reads the ancient text, and he found, or the Chinese people help him to find the idea of monotheism. And so especially the idea of Shangdi, of Tian, also the belief in the immortality of the soul, the concept of Run or Guishen. So that is going to adopt this kind of positive reading. But at the same time, Matteo Ricci is going to reject Neo-Confucianism, especially the concept of Li, Taiji, Qi, Yin Yang. So that are the key concepts of Neo-Confucianism, which are not so much prevalent in ancient Confucianism. And but what is interesting, Matteo Ricci rejects Neo-Confucianism. It is not on the ground of the kind of general deceit, according to the Japanese Catechism or according to Rodriguez, but Ricci rejected Neo-Confucianism based on Aristotle. Is to say that according to Aristotle, you need a distinction between a substance and accident, between efficient and the final cause and other causes, material cause, formal causes. So Matteo Ricci applied the conceptual frame of scholasticism of Aristotle, and he said that the Neo-Confucianism, in fact, has no transcendence, and so is an immanent philosophy. And so, of course, he reads it a bit like a kind of materialism. And so here we have, in the Tianzhu Shui, Matteo Ricci mentioned Neo-Confucianism, and especially the book of Zhou Dongyi, which talks about the Taiji. The Taiji moves, it gives a birth to yang. And when the movement is at its extremity, it becomes still, and stillness gives birth to yin. And so here you have on the drawing, you have, I mean, the representation of the Taiji and is unfolding, how the Taiji unfold into the 10,000 concrete things. But Matteo Ricci is going to criticize this philosophy, and especially he has one question that he addressed to the Chinese scholar. Matteo Ricci say, may I ask you, sir, if the principle of yin and yang and the five elements have produced yin and yang and the five elements at the moment between action and quiescence, how is it that the principle of a carriage now in existence are unable to produce a carriage? So according to Ricci, in fact, the idea of the genesis or the production of things, he reads that, I mean, according to Confucianism, as a kind of a spontaneous creation, a spontaneous transformation. And so he asked why today and the principle somehow cannot create a new concrete object. So for him, if there is something already in action, he should constantly create new things. And so he used that somehow to criticize the idea that in Neo-Confucianism, we don't have an idea of efficient cause. And here I would like to talk about, I mean, a document which is attached to the Tianzhu Shui. In fact, they are notes, manuscript notes of Matteo Ricci. And in that note, he says the teaching about the Taiji is recent, because in fact, in ancient China, Taiji has not a very important role. It is only with the Song philosopher that is very important. So he say 500 years ago. And so the teaching of Taiji contradict their ancient wise, who had a more correct understanding of God. So that, of course, the idea of Shangdi, of Tian. Their Taiji is nothing more than our prime matter. So he said that, in fact, the Taiji, it is something that we know very well in pre-Socratic philosophy, something that has been very much criticized by Aristotle. It is a prime matter. And so, but Matteo Ricci continue, he say, but if they would understand the Taiji as the first beginning, substantial, intelligent, and infinite, then we could confirm that it is nothing else but God. So here, there is a kind of supposition of Matteo Ricci. If we give to Taiji this kind of attributes of first beginning, of substance, intelligence, then it is possible to say that Taiji is identical to God. But in fact, Ricci does not follow up on that. And so he stays on his idea of condemnation of the Taiji of the Neo-Confucianism. So after Matteo Ricci, someone very important is Longobardo. And Longobardo, of course, has been very much influenced by Rodriguez. When Rodriguez left Japan, went to Macau, and after he met with Longobardo, and he influenced Longobardo into what we call the name controversy, the controversy about the names of God. And so Longobardo writes this answer to the controversy on the Shandi, Guishan, and Lingrun. And in fact, Longobardo understands ancient classics, but he said to understand those ancient classics, we need to read the song philosopher. And so he goes against Matteo Ricci, who tried to read the ancient classics by himself without the Neo-Confucianism. And he's going to use a book, it is called the Xingli Dachuan. Is a very is a compendium, and which is used especially for to train the student who want to attend to participate to the exam. And so he's going to read especially the parts about Shoyong, Zhangzai, Jushi, the song philosopher. And is going to do a systematic refutation of Taiji, Li, Qi, Yin and Yang, still based on Aristotle. And he understands those categories as materialistic. And therefore, Christianity should also reject the ancient concept of Shandi, Guishan, and Run. So I think the argumentation of Longobardo is not very powerful, because in fact he say to understand the ancient classics you have to read the song philosopher, and the song philosopher are materialistic, so the ancient classics also are materialistic. And so it is this way that he tried to go against Ricci. So we can read, I mean, a passage of Longobardo. He say, it seems to me that someone could perhaps wonder whether the Chinese wish to indicate the creator of all things and our true God with the term Li or Taiji, since such wondrous attribute can belong to our true God alone and not to any other. So here it is again the same supposition of Matteo Ricci. And the idea, could Taiji be an equivalent of God? But Longobardo say, take heed, for a snake lies under the grass, and a dreadful Leviathan under the calm wave. Let no one be seduced by so many wondrous titles. So that again, it is the idea of Rodriguez, the idea of a deceit. It looks like religious, like a transcendental, but it is not. And so what it is nothing else than our physical prime matter. So again, we go back to the idea also of Matteo Ricci, that the Taiji is only a prime matter. And for those wondrous words are false, external. So to the false, external, it means, again, it is the idea of Rodriguez. It is external teaching, but internally, it is dangerous. So again, he said that they attribute many imperfections to it. So same as Ricci, and they say the Taiji, it seems, has no substance, no intelligence, etc. So after Longobardo, of course, we have a very important work, which is the Confucius in Arum Philosophus, which is partly in response to Longobardo. And this work, in fact, why it is because the report of Longobardo was suppressed at one point, and he resurfaced in Canton in 1668. And so because of Longobardo report, Intercetta, Couplet, they need to make, to answer the critique of Longobardo to defend Matteo Ricci. And so we have a very strong defense of the reading of ancient Confucianism, but at the same time, Intercetta and Couplet, same as Ricci and Longobardo, they strongly reject Jushi. And they are going to use the term of Jushi as being an ateo-politician. It means that his thinking is atheistic, and is also is a politician because he tried to use religion as a way to control the common people. And so it is a perverse use of religion. And so that it is a strong accusation against Jushi. And so now I turn to the main topic, which is François Noel. So François Noel in Chinese is called Wei Fangji, and is born in Estrude, so is in Flanders. Right now it is part of France. And he joined the French-Belgian province in 1670, and he studied at the Jesuit College of Dachau. So the College of Dachau, in fact, was integrated in the University of Douai, still at that time in Flanders. And in 1684, he left for the East, and in 85, he arrived at Macau, and he had a strong desire to martyrdom, and so he volunteered to go to Japan. And but in fact, he could not succeed to go to Japan and to be a martyr for the faith, but instead he went to mainland. And he went first to Shanghai and to Huai'an in the Jiangsu province. And finally, he settled for more than around 10 years in the Jiangxi province, Nanchang. And what is very important is that in Nanchang, he's going to do a lot of pastoral work, but also he's going to study the Chinese classics and the commentary. And in fact, he has published only one book in Chinese. So in Chinese, the book is called Zhenzui Zhizhong. So the extreme seriousness of human sin, 1698 is the only work in Chinese. And he has many quotes from Mencius, from the Book of Odes, from the Book of Documents, from the Chunqiu. But he strongly rejects what he calls vulgar Confucianism, Suzhu. So what is Suzhu for Noël? In fact, he says, it is clear that Tian and Shandi should not be explained with the empty concept of Li, and Jue Puneng I Li Zhi Xuming Wei Jie. So that what he means by this vulgar Confucianism, in fact, it is the Confucianism of the Song dynasty, the Song philosopher based on Li and Dao, Tian, etc. So it's very clear already in 1698, somehow he follows the line of all the Jesuits before him, rejecting Neo-Confucianism. In fact, after that, he's going also to be sent back to Rome, and is going to publish 2 books which deal, in fact, directly with the Chinese rite. And so those 2 books are published in 1703 and 1704. And here, what is important is that we have the name of the Pope here, that he said that the book has been oblatum, is offered to the Pope Clement XI. And because in fact, he had already received at that time an authorization of the Pope to publish books about the Chinese rite, because it was a time in 1703, 1704, there was an open discussion through publication in Europe at that time. After those 2 works, in fact, he returned to China, but meanwhile, Tournon de Maillard has already reached mainland China, and he had promulgated the interdiction of the Chinese rite. And in July 1707, Noël also arrived in Macau. So what is interesting is that in January 1708, Noël is going to leave Macau. So in his second time in China, somehow, he's going to stay only for 6 months, half year. And so it is quite strange why, after such a long journey, and very dangerous. Noël, only after 6 months, is sent back. So perhaps one reason is kind of sinological expertise, which is very needed because of the right controversy, but perhaps also there is a kind of health issue, especially a psychological issue, and probably also is related also to the tension with the Chinese right. So in 1709, in February, he arrived in Rome, and 1 year later, or 1 year and a half later, in September 1710, the Pope Clement XI promulgated the decree condemning the Chinese right, and he forbade any further publication. So it was forbidden to publish anything on the subject anymore because the Chinese right had been condemned. So, but what happened is that 1 year or few months after the interdiction of the Pope, in fact, we have 2 works published by Noël. They are published in Prague. You see here the name Prague, so in the Czech Republic, so quite far away from Rome. And the first book is about the classic books of China, the Libri Classici Sex, and the 6 books. So this book, in fact, is not has no problem with Rome, because this book mostly is a literal translation of the classics. So there is not much problem with this work. But the second work, it is called the Philosophia Sinica. So the title sounds a very neutral title, and Chinese philosophy. But if we look at the 3 parts of that book, the first part is about the cognitio primi entis, about the knowledge of the first being. And the second book is about the ceremony for the dead. And the third is about morality. So the problem is the second book, or the second part of this work, the Philosophia Sinica, directly deals with the Chinese right controversy and to defend the Chinese right. So somehow goes completely against the order of the Pope. So in fact, what happened is that book, just after publication, was suppressed. So I think my understanding probably is that the book was first published because perhaps it was received the backup of Andreas Webel, who was in fact the assistant for Germany. And so perhaps Webel somehow covered this kind of publication in Prague. But when the book was published, of course, there was a lot of criticism against the Jesuits because they were saying, you see, they disobey the Pope. So the Superior General, Michelangelo Tamburini, he had to write to the Pope a formal declaration of obedience. And at that time in Rome, there were all the procurators being gathered. And so they have to sign a document to say that they will obey the Pope about the Chinese right. And so we see that after that, the book, the Philosophia Sinica, is going to be suppressed or to be restricted to the Jesuit only. So, I mean, if we can find, for example, on the cover of some books, which were in the Jesuit libraries, we have here a manuscript note to say, Tomus hic ex specialis licentia Clemens 11 papae privatim legi. So it explains somehow that there was a special license by the Pope, which means that the Jesuit could read privately the book, but not to be diffused outside. So you see that the book somehow was restricted within the Jesuit order. But even inside the Jesuit order, you need to have a permission of the Father General to read the book. For example, in 1733, we have Antoine Gobil, is a missionary in Beijing, and he has to write to the Father General in Rome asking an authorization to get a copy of the Philosophia Sinica. So now I would like to discuss a little bit about the first book, which is, which you say the most, the philosophical part or the metaphysical part or theological part. Is about the knowledge on God. And so this book, in fact, has 3 chapters, which are presented chronologically. So the first chapter deals about the knowledge of God in ancient China, so the ancient books, and so the spring and autumn, Qin dynasty, Han dynasty. Also, we have a second chapter about the modern China, and so that's based on the commentator from the Song dynasty, Yuan, Ming, and Qing. And we have a third chapter about contemporary China, which is going to incorporate testimonies of the missionaries, but also a Chinese Christian, also Jews, Muslim, a pagan Chinese, and even a Kangxi about how do they understand in China the knowledge of God, and about the idea of Tian, Shangdi. Does it represent a knowledge of God? So if we look at how the book is written, here you have a picture about the chapter, is the beginning of the chapter, Caput 1, and the first chapter about the knowledge of the first being. And it is done in a very scholastic way, using a question and answer. But also there is a kind also of a scriptural way, because every time to answer the question, you have a textus librorum. It means you have a quote from the books, and the quote, and they are in fact a translation from the Chinese into Latin by a Noël. And so most of the work, in fact, are a quotation, a Chinese quotation translated into Latin by a Noël. And what he has done, he has classified the quotes, arranged them, and classified them, and made an argumentation. So when we have this printed book in 1711, we do not have the Chinese text. But for the Chinese text, in fact, we are very lucky for the first part of the Philosophia Sinica. We have the manuscript in Rome, in the Jesuit archive in Rome. So you can see here we have the Latin text, but also we have the quotation from the Chinese, which were written by hand by Noël when he was in Rome, because Noël brought many books from Rome, from China to Rome. And so he had all those quotations that he himself wrote. We have another manuscript which is in Paris, at Bibliothèque Nationale de France, but in that manuscript we have only the Latin. We don't have the Chinese. And there is also another manuscript in Arras, but I haven't checked yet this manuscript. But the Latin manuscripts are still interesting because they may show the evolution of Noël, how he works little by little. So, in fact, the method of the quotation used by Noël is not something new, but it is something which has been done by the missionaries from very early on. Because the missionary, when they read the Chinese classics, they try to find a quotation about the Tian, Shangdi, or the Guishan, and so they try to find those quotation in the books, and they arrange those quotes according to the categories of God. So the first to do that, I mean, we know is Matteo Ricci. In the Tianzhu Shui, he has 11 quotes from the ancient classics about God, about Tian or Shangdi, to prove that the ancient Chinese use those words. But also we have a Chinese Christian called Paul Yanmo. He wrote that work called Di Tianka. Also is made of is a accumulation and a compilation of quotes. And we find that there are, in fact, in the Di Tianka, there are 35 quotes, which we can find also in the Philosophia Sinica. And there is another work also by a Bouvet. So Bouvet writes around the 1701 this Gu Jin Jingtian. So Jingtian is the respect of heaven, and the Gu Jin is the ancient time and today. And so why it is today? Because in fact Bouvet is going into his work to make mention of a book published by the Kangxi emperor called the Zhejiang Seshu. So that is a commentary and made for the Kangxi emperor, and he is using also we have many overlaps between the book of Bouvet and the Philosophia Sinica. But the classification is a bit different because the Bouvet classify in 42 topics, but Noël has only a more simple classification, talking only about the perfection of God, only 7 perfection of God. And so I would like also to mention the name of Zhang Xingyao, which is also, we can find in his work also many quotes which are also in the Philosophia Sinica. So what is interesting is all those people are doing this kind of compilation of quotes, but all of them, they all reject the key concept of Neo-Confucianism. Even Bouvet reject Taiji, reject Li, and even the Chinese Christian like Zhang Xingyao reject Neo-Confucianism. And because they say, as a Chinese Christian, we have to express the distinctiveness, the difference of Catholicism. So we should not accept Neo-Confucianism. So Zhang Xingyao is very strong against Neo-Confucianism. And so in this chart, you can see here, I have the different works by the Jesuit or the Chinese Christian, and the works, the ancient works that they are using. So we see that most of them, they are using the book of the Shujing or the Shangshu, the book of documents, because you have many quotations about Tian and about Shangdi. So we have many quotes. The Tiandu Shui has a free from the Shujing, but the Ditianka by Paul Yen has a 33. This one by Zhang Xingyao, you have 100, and the Philosophia Sinica has a 42. The book of Odes also is very important, and so we have many quotes from the book of Odes. We see that the book of the I Ching is not very well represented, except with Baijin, with Bouvet. So, because in the beginning, the missionaries are very cautious about the I Ching, but only with Bouvet became very important. Yes, and so we have all those quotes. And we can see that, for example, in the Tiandu Shui, we have only 11 quotes, but in the Ditian Ka, we have 65, and in the Zhang Xingyao, we have more than 200, and the Philosophia Sinica, 100, a quote from the ancient books. So now if we look at the attribute of God, so the attribute of God, in fact, mostly represented are the dominion of God and the power of God. And so we have many quotes coming from the Shujing, but also the justice of God, and so is represented. So we have all those attributes which are supported by those quotes. Here, I mean, I have another chart to show that, in fact, concretely, the quotes which are quoted by Noël, in fact, can be found in the other works by the Chinese Christian or the Jesuit. For example, if we take the category of dominion of God, so A1, we have a quote by Noël from the Shujing. And we can find the same quote in Ditianka, in the work of Paul Yen. And the same quote also can be found in Bouvet, number 28, and also in the Zhang Xingyao. So we can find, in fact, there is the work of Noël, especially for the ancient works, the ancient classics, basically, is based on the work of his predecessor. So it's a kind of accumulation of quotes. But what is new with Noël? something very new. It is the acceptation of Neo-Confucianism, because before him, we don't have anyone who argue to accept the concept of Taiji, to accept the philosophy of Jushi. So why is doing that? Perhaps there are different influences. Perhaps one influence is Bouvet and an Augustinian called Alvaro de Benavente, because those two, in fact, they say that the literati of their time have some knowledge of God. So to say that the present literati know something of God, so they are not completely atheistic. So somehow they reject the characterization of Matteo Ricci, of Longobardo, and that all the literati are atheistic. But still, they reject Neo-Confucianism. Perhaps there is an influence coming from Filippucci, who had died in 1692 in Macau, and he had left in Canton many works on Chinese philosophy. And so perhaps Noël was influenced by that. But also perhaps there is the influence of the literati in Nanchang who helped Noël to accept Neo-Confucianism. So what are the commentaries used by Noël? So when we talk about the 4 books, he's using, of course, Jushi, the Seshu Jiju, which is the reference book, but we can notice that Noël, all the time when he mentions Jushi, it is indirect quote. And so he mentions the name of Jushi, but the name of Jushi is quoted from other work. And of course, we have Zhang Zhizheng. So Zhang Zhizheng, which was very much used very early on, and especially by the Confucius Sinarum Philosophus. So here we have 20 quotes from the Seshu Zhenjie. But also what is very new is a work of Tsai Ching. So Tsai Ching is a very important philosopher in the Ming Dynasty. It's important historically because he is a main philosopher who continue the idea of Jushi. And so he wrote that book, Seshu Mongin. And you see, we have 56 quotes from him. And of course, we have the Zhejiang Seshu by Kangxi. But beside the commentary on the 4 books, we have also the commentary on the 5 classics. For example, on the Shujing, using Tsai Chen, that is a Song dynasty. About the Liji, they use someone from the Yuan dynasty. About the I Ching, they use a work which is not very famous, which is the Zhouyi Zhengjie, but is a very recent work published in 1693. So only 20 years before the Philosophia Sinica. And we have also the Book of Odds, which is also a work not very much famous, this commentary. So in fact, when we look at all those commentaries, as I say, today you can find all those commentaries are found in the Jesuit archive in Rome. Why? Because Noël himself or the other Jesuit brought this book with them. And so we have, thanks to the catalog of Albert Chan, we have a very precise catalog of the works. And so it's very important because this catalog gives us the edition used by the edition which are held in Rome. And so we know precisely what kind of book, what kind of edition were used by Noël and to do his work. So here I have another chart to show the Philosophia Sinica, the chapter 2, which is dedicated to Neo-Confucianism. And see, here we have again the attributes of God, the dominion, the power, knowledge, will, justice, life, immensity, eternity, simplicity. And so here he again is going to use the commentaries of the Ming Dynasty or Qing Dynasty or Song Dynasty to comment and so to explain. And so we have, so he's using completely and those commentaries. And so he's adopting the point of view of the Song philosopher, or Ming and Qing, to understand Chinese philosophy. And after the 7 attributes of God, he has also some specific chapter dealing with, especially with the key concept of Neo-Confucianism. For example, he has a chapter about the idea of Tian or Shandi in Neo-Confucianism, also about Li, about Guishen, about Jiaoshi. So Jiaoshi, they are the rituals, and the Taiji. So for all this concept, he's using also the commentaries of the Song, Ming and Qing. So we see here, for example, for the Seshu Mongyin, the book by Cai Qing, he has 56 quotes from the Seshu Mongyin, and mostly dealing with the concept of Li, with Guishen. Also, he's using a lot the book by the Zhouyi Zhengjie, and probably that it is an influence of Bouvet. We have 47 quotes, and so especially to discuss about the Guishen, because the Guishen, according to Neo-Confucianism, it is made of yin and yang, and so we have here very important. I Ching is very important to understand the Guishen for Neo-Confucianism. But also we have the commentary on the Li Ji, because it discusses about the rituals to heaven and earth. So basically we see that he has in fact 268 quotes coming from the commentaries from the Song to the Qing dynasty. So now if we move to the key concept, the concept of Taiji, according to the Chinese, in fact, Noël recognized they have 4 meanings. 4 meanings, but there are 2 meanings which perhaps are not very much relevant for the idea of God, because the first meaning of Taiji is the essence of a particular thing, and to say that each concrete thing has its own Taiji. So, but that, of course, this idea of essence cannot be matched with the idea of God. So that he does not discuss much about it. And also another conception of Taiji, according to the Chinese, is a total aggregate of the natural agents. To say that the Taiji somehow is a sum, the sum of all the natural elements. But that again, it cannot be the idea of a transcendental God. So he does not really discuss also. But he's going to discuss mostly about the 2 concepts of Taiji, according to the Chinese, which can match the idea of God. So the first one is about the idea of nature as a creating nature, and the second is about the motion, of the origin of motion. So let us look first at the first one, the creating nature. So creating nature, in fact, is my translation of the term natura naturans. It is very difficult to translate into English, because natura is nature and naturans is a participle, which means a kind of activity of nature, which is making nature, nature making nature. So I translate as creating nature. And here Noël mentioned the commentary of Zhodongyi and explained by Zhuxi, and he said that the operation of nature of heaven above is without voice, smell, or sensation, yet it is truly the efficient cause, the pivot, and the basis of all things. So here, efficient cause, in fact, is to translate the idea of Zhaohua Zhe Shunyo. So it's the idea that in this Chinese commentary, we have the idea of efficient cause, a cause which is transcendental. It is not within the world, but it is transcendental. It gives a rise to the world. And we have also another passage, for example, of Zhongyong 26, where here the Zhongyong, or the commentary by Cai Qing, discuss the Zhongyong and discuss about Zhu Zai Zhe. So Zhuzaiji translates as the master and guide. So master and guide, of course, read in the background of Noel is the idea of God, and the idea, and that it is contrasted to Gongyong. So the Gongyong is the effects. So it is to say that the Taiji has two dimensions. The Taiji, it is a master and guide because it is the one which is transcending, which is above the world, at the same time is active within the world through his effects. So the Taiji is both transcendent and immanent, is above the world and within the world. And so it is this idea of natura naturans, that is say, it is clear now that the Taiji, or the first ultimate, often means this kind of substance, the unique and spiritual cause, the Lord of heaven, God as a seen objectively, the first creator of all things, natura naturans. So what you see, it is the idea of Taiji as God. So by identifying, by making this identification between Taiji and God, Noel expresses its twofold transcendence. And Taiji is a producer of the world and also the active principle within the world. And somehow this kind of idea of God try to go beyond the dualism of traditional theology of creation, because in the theology of creation we have the idea of a transcendental God creating a God, creating a world, a creature. But it seems we have a kind of ontological divide between a God as a creator and the creature. So of course we know that Thomas Aquinas has a metaphysical reading of the idea of creation, and it is not the temporal reading of creation as successive in time. But still, I think the idea of natura naturans try somehow to go beyond this kind of divide between a creator and a creature. And try to express the idea that God also is on the side of the creature, is immanent to the world. But Noel, in fact, also say that we have some similar ideas in the pre-Socratic. So we have a philosopher like Democritus and Epicurus, which express the idea of God as nature or God as physis. So of course, those philosophers were very much criticized by Aristotle and criticized later on by all the scholasticism. They criticize the pre-Socratic. But it seems that Noel tried to find a support also from the pre-Socratic. And perhaps also there is an influence of Baruch Spinoza, because Spinoza, of course, in his book of Ethica, which was published just after his death in 1677. Of course, because also the book was suppressed a bit like the Philosophia Sinica. So the book of Ethica by Spinoza was circulating very discreetly. But everybody at that time was reading Spinoza, and he talks about the natura naturans and the natura naturata. So we have this kind of a common concept of nature, which try to link between the active part and the passive part, between the creator and the creature. So I think perhaps we cannot exclude the idea that perhaps Noel was exposed to some ideas from Baruch Spinoza. But perhaps also we can find also some ideas in Francisco Suarez and the Jesuit philosopher, when he talks about the being of things, the being of all the things. The character of being is transcendent and intimately included in all the properties and all determinate kinds of being, and in the determinate modes of being themselves. So here, I mean, Suarez talk about all the beings, the being of all things in general, but that could be also applied to God as a being, and also being a transcendent, and also being already included in all the properties. So probably there is we see a kind of, in the 17th century, this kind of ideas, perhaps trying also to express this idea of God, God as a creator in a different way than traditionally before. So there is the second idea, which is perhaps interesting also for Noel, is the idea of Taiji as a remote origin of motion. But here it talks about a substance, yin and yang. And also you understand that the yin and yang are transcendental relationship, because in the sense that the yin tends to be something that is not. Yin tends to be yang, and yang tends to be yin. So that I think is quite interesting understanding in Noel. But of course, he said that we can talk loosely about God as nature being the prime mover. And because, of course, this argument that the God is a prime mover has been very much criticized already at his time. So he talks about loosely. So now I would like to express perhaps some proper limitation in Noel. First, Noel does not really articulate the different meaning of Taiji to each other. So he said that there are 4 meanings of Taiji, but he does not really understand how those 4 meanings can be linked together, because I think he does not have the tools to do that. And especially he does not explain the Li Feng Shu, which is the key axiom in Neo-Confucianism. Also, he said that the Taiji is vague, uncertain, and applied indiscriminately to different objects, indicating the whole, the part, the substance, the accident, the creature, or the creator. So he recognized somehow that the discourse on Taiji in China has been problematic, even though he understands that the Taiji could be interpreted as God in one level. But he said that the father of the China mission have always rejected the term of Taiji to express God. So that it's quite clear in terms of the ecclesiastical use of the term should be for him not so much Tianzhu. He doesn't really like Tianzhu, but in fact he will prefer Shandi or even Tian, because the Tian or Shandi, all the Chinese will understand what it is. But the Tianzhu is a neologism basically for him. So now I come to my conclusion. Philosophia Sinica is an important work, but which has been overlooked. And I explain why historically that book has been suppressed by the Jesuits themselves, but of course because of the pressure from Rome and from the people who were against the Chinese right. So on the basis of his predecessor, Noel had selected many commentaries from the Song to the Qing dynasty, and he has organized the material in a very logical way. So in the first treatise, he focused on the core question of the Western tradition, the possibility of a human knowledge on God. And this was the key issue of what we call the term controversy. And, not the right controversy, but the term or the name controversy. What are the name of God? And so could Taiji be a name for God? And so because Noel investigates Neo-Confucianism with this Western question in mind, perhaps it does not reach the point of thinking within the Chinese tradition. But still he has done a lot of work, because really he has spent a lot of work in translating, understanding those work. And so what remains meaningful is that he was challenged by Neo-Confucianism in finding ways to go beyond the traditional divide in Western philosophy or theology between the creator and the created world, between spirit and matter, between also to go beyond the idea of anthropomorphic God. And he came up with this concept of nature to explain Taiji as God. So I think also another important contribution of Noel is to show the continuity of the Chinese tradition, because with Ricci and Longobardo, we have a kind of, or even the Confuciusinarum, we have a kind of a break, a rupture in the tradition, that ancient Confucianism was good, but after turned bad. But here, Noel shows the continuity of the Chinese tradition, and you see that there is that the Chinese have always believed in a kind of an idea of transcendental idea, a transcendental concept to explain the reality. So with this, I finish my talk. 谢谢你们。